protracted upward toward the sky. Inside the star is a pentagram, and inside the pentagram are 5 symbols arranged around a central letter, one symbol in each of the 5 triangular points of the inverted star. The symbols are a sword and a veil, a sheaf of wheat, a lion's head, a cup, and a crown with a broken column. The central letter is the letter G, the same letter that appears at the center of the square and compass of Freemasonry. Around the outer edge of the star, each point is colored: blue, yellow, white, green, and red. The whole device is surrounded by a circular band bearing the motto that the organization has used since its founding in the middle of the 19th century. The motto is, "We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." This is the symbol of the Order of the Eastern Star, the largest fraternal organization in the world that admits both men and women, with an estimated membership of over 1 million people in chapters across the United States and in dozens of countries around the world. It was founded in the 1850s by a man who spent most of his adult life attempting to give women access to the Masonic world that excluded them, and it has been connected to Freemasonry since its inception in a relationship of institutional proximity, an official distance that has shaped the Order's identity for the entire span of its existence. It conducts initiatory ceremonies of considerable elaboration, built around 5 biblical heroines whose stories are encoded in the 5 points of the inverted star, and whose virtues the Order presents to its members as a moral curriculum. It operates in chapter rooms arranged in a specific spatial configuration, with officers positioned at precise locations and a ceremonial floor plan, whose symbolism is as deliberate as anything in a Masonic lodge. It has produced members of extraordinary consequence, has been present at some of the most significant moments in American political and cultural history, and has served as one of the primary institutional vehicles through which the tradition of women's fraternal organization has been maintained in the English-speaking world for the better part of 2 centuries. And yet the Order of the Eastern Star is almost completely absent from the mainstream historical account of American fraternal and religious life, overlooked by the scholars who study Freemasonry, underrepresented in the histories of women's organizations, and known to most people, if it is known at all, as a vague and slightly exotic footnote to the better documented story of the lodges it has always stood adjacent to. The invisibility is partly a function of the Order's own commitment to discretion, partly a function of the broader cultural tendency to treat women's institutions as secondary to the male institutions they are affiliated with, and partly a function of something that the Order's history suggests is more deliberate than accidental: this specific choice to locate the Order's most serious work, its initiatory structure, its symbolic system, and its philosophical ambitions in a space that the casual observer would not find worth examining closely.
For the first time in modern history, college student graduates are more...
This is the full story of the Order of the Eastern Star. And to tell it properly, it has to begin not in the middle of the 19th century when the Order was formally organized, but much earlier in the specific tradition of women's initiation and women's secret knowledge that the Order was drawing from when its founder sat down to write the rituals that would define it. The exclusion of women from the formal structures of Freemasonry is one of the oldest and most consistent features of the organization's institutional life, and it is also one that was contested from very early in the Masonic tradition. The foundational documents of Freemasonry, the old charges that codified the operative Masons' Guild customs before the formation of the First Grand Lodge in 1717, did not address the question of women's admission, because the question did not arise in the context of a working craft whose practitioners were almost exclusively male. But speculative Freemasonry, the philosophical fraternity that emerged from the operative craft in the early 18th century, was a creation of a social world in which women were present and active participants in intellectual and cultural life. And the exclusion of women from the lodge rooms was not a natural consequence of the work, but a deliberate institutional choice whose specific justifications were debated from the beginning and never fully resolved. In France, where Freemasonry arrived in the 1720s and developed with a social character somewhat different from its English original, the pressure to include women in some form of Masonic initiation produced, by the 1730s and 40s, the creation of adoptive lodges, a form of mixed or women's Masonic organization conducted under the patronage of regular male lodges, in which women could be initiated into a set of degrees adapted from the male system, and could participate in lodge life in a way that the regular Masonic constitution did not permit. The adoptive lodges developed their own symbolic system and their own degree structure, drawing on biblical narrative and classical mythology in ways that were recognizably Masonic in their approach to the use of allegory and symbol as vehicles for moral and philosophical instruction. The Grand Orient of France formally recognized adoptive Masonry in 1774 at a ceremony presided over by the Duchess of Bourbon, and for the remainder of the 18th century and into the 19th, the adoptive lodges were a significant feature of French Masonic culture, attracting women of the highest social standing and contributing to the development of a distinctly French tradition of mixed fraternal organization. Marie Antoinette was initiated into an adoptive lodge. The Empress Josephine, Napoleon's first wife, was a member of an adoptive lodge and served as its grand mistress. The connections between the adoptive lodge tradition and the political and social history of France in the late 18th and early 19th centuries are more extensive than the standard accounts of either Freemasonry or the French Revolutionary period acknowledge, and the specific role that women initiated through the adoptive system played in the networks of information and influence that shaped the events of that period has been a subject of scholarly inquiry without ever having been fully traced. The American tradition that produced the Order of the Eastern Star drew on this French inheritance, but developed its own character in response to the specific social and religious culture of the United States in the middle of the 19th century. The man who created the Eastern Star degree system was Rob Morris, a Kentucky schoolteacher and poet and committed Freemason, who'd been initiated into Masonry in 1846, and who had spent the years following his initiation, working his way through the degree structure of the Scottish Rite, and developing an increasingly systematic interest in the question of whether the benefits of Masonic membership, specifically the specific combination of moral education, fraternal support, and initiatory experience that Morris genuinely believed the Masonic system provided, could be extended to women in a form that was consistent with both the Masonic tradition and the religious culture of mid-19th century America. Morris was not a radical in the sense of wanting to overturn the male exclusivity of the Masonic lodge itself. He was conservative in most of his social and religious views, a man whose world was organized around biblical narrative and Christian morality, and the specific civic culture of the American South and Midwest.
My name is Mary, and I'm really not sure how to go about doing this, and I try not to be.
South and Midwest in the 1850s. What he wanted was something more modest than institutional equality, but also, in its own way, more philosophically interesting. He wanted to create a system in which women could receive, through a set of degrees built specifically for them, the same kind of initiatory moral education that the Masonic system provided for men. He wanted to give women what he believed Masonry had given him, which was a framework for understanding the moral architecture of human life, yet structured through the specific mechanism of initiation and symbol and narrative that he believed was uniquely effective in producing genuine ethical transformation. The system he developed between approximately 1848 and 1850 was built around 5 women from the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, each representing a specific virtue, each associated with a specific color and a specific symbol, and each taught through a degree that used the narrative of her life and the circumstances of her exemplary action as the vehicle for conveying the moral lesson she was supposed to embody. The 5 heroines were Ada, the daughter of Jephthah, whose story in the book of Judges ends in one of the most devastating acts of sacrificial obedience in the entire Hebrew Bible, associated with the color blue and the virtue of fidelity. Ruth, the Moabite woman whose loyalty to her mother-in-law Naomi after the death of both their husbands became one of the most celebrated acts of devotion in Scripture, associated with the color yellow and the virtue of constancy. Esther, the Jewish queen of Persia, who risked her life to save her people from genocide, associated with the color white and the virtue of loyalty. Martha, the sister of Lazarus in the Gospel of John, associated with the color green and the virtue of faith. And Electa, not a biblical figure by that name, but a symbolic representation drawn from the second letter of John, describing a woman addressed as the elect lady who has offered her home as a gathering place for the persecuted early Christian community, associated with the color red and the virtue of love. The 5 stories taken together constitute a curriculum in the specific virtues that Morris believed were the foundation of moral life, and the specific women he chose to embody those virtues were all, without exception, women whose virtue was expressed through action in the world rather than through passive piety. Ada followed her father's rash vow into death rather than break faith. Ruth left her own people and her own country to maintain a loyalty she was under no obligation to maintain. Esther walked uninvited into the throne room of a king who had the power to execute anyone who approached him without being summoned, and she walked in with a request that required the king to reverse a policy he had already publicly committed to. Martha met Jesus on the road before he arrived at Lazarus's tomb and argued with him about the nature of resurrection in terms that no other figure in the Gospels approaches so directly. Electa opened her home to the persecuted and kept it open. These are not women who submitted to circumstances. They are women who acted in circumstances that made action dangerous and who acted with a clarity of moral purpose that Morris believed was the foundation of genuine character. The degree system Morris created was not simply a set of moral lessons delivered in the mode of Sunday school instruction. It was a genuine initiatory system, structured in the specific way that initiatory systems work, through the use of symbolic death and rebirth, through the requirement that the candidate pass through a sequence of experiences that are designed to produce genuine psychological and emotional engagement, rather than passive reception of information, through the use of physical gesture and spatial orientation and specific language that creates a different quality of attention from ordinary social interaction. Morris had been formed by the Masonic system, and he understood what initiation was and what it was capable of doing, and he built Eastern Star degrees with the same deliberate craft that the Masonic degrees had been built with, adapted to the specific narratives and the specific symbolic vocabulary he had chosen. The symbol he chose for the system, the inverted 5-pointed star, has been the source of more controversy and more misunderstanding than any other element of the order's public identity. The inverted star, the pentagram with a single point directed downward, is in popular culture and in the imagination of those who regard the Order of the Eastern Star with suspicion, a symbol of diabolism associated with Satanism and black magic, and the deliberate inversion of sacred symbols that is one of the conventional gestures of the left-hand path in occult tradition. The association is not without historical basis in a general sense. The inverted pentagram has been used in some traditions as a symbol of the material over the spiritual, of the earthly over the celestial, and this association has been exploited by both practitioners of left-hand traditions who chose it deliberately and critics of various organizations who seized on it as evidence of hidden diabolism. The Order of the Eastern Star's use of the inverted star has been cited in anti-Masonic and anti-Eastern Star literature since the Order's founding as proof that the organization is secretly a vehicle for satanic worship. And this accusation has been among the most persistent and most damaging pieces of misinformation attached to the Order's public image. The actual explanation for the inverted star in the Eastern Star symbol is considerably more specific and considerably less dramatic than the diabolism charge suggests. The 5 points of the star correspond to the 5 heroines of the degree system, and the specific arrangement of the points and the colors attached to them was designed by Morris to produce a specific letter when read in sequence. Reading the initials of the colors attached to each point of the star in the order they are arranged, the sequence produces a 5-letter word that Morris intended as the guiding word of the entire system.
Hello, my name is Adam Ferrari, the Chief Executive Officer of Phoenix Energy. I look forward to you joining us at our next investor webinar, where you can drill deeper into our 9 to 13% annual interest rate bond offerings and see how our company has become an emerging leader in the oil and gas industry. In 2024, Phoenix Energy rose to become the 11th most prolific oil and gas operator in the Williston Basin, one of America's top producing.
Fatal. The blue point for Ada, the yellow point for Ruth, the white point for Esther, the green point for Martha, the red point for Electa. F for fidelity, A for Ada, or alternately for the first point's color, T for the third, A for the fourth, L for the fifth, the specific arrangement varying by the specific account Morris gave at different times. The word fatal in Morris's framework referred not to death, but to the Latin root fatum, meaning fate or destiny. The idea that the moral character expressed through the 5 heroine stories was the foundation of genuine human destiny, understood in the classical sense. The inverted star was an arrangement of 5 points to form a specific acrostic, not a deliberate inversion of sacred geometry. Whether or not this explanation fully accounts for the symbol's specific orientation is a question that the Order's critics have always declined to treat as settled, and in fairness, the history of symbolic systems in the Western esoteric tradition does not require that a symbol mean only one thing at one time. Morris was steeped in the Masonic tradition, in which symbols were understood to have multiple levels of meaning simultaneously, no, in which the outer explanation given to the uninitiated and the inner meaning accessible to those who had pursued the symbol further were understood to be complementary rather than contradictory. The Eastern Star symbol may have been both an acrostic for a Latin word about moral destiny and an inverted pentagram whose specific orientation connected it to other traditions of symbolic meaning in ways that Morris was aware of and chose deliberately. The two explanations do not exclude each other. The formal organization of the Order of the Eastern Star did not happen in Morris's lifetime in the way he had originally envisioned. He created the degree system and distributed it widely, initiating women and men through what he called the Rosary of the Eastern Star in the years between 1850 and 1860, just traveling across the eastern and midwestern United States, and performing the degrees for groups who received them with a combination of enthusiasm and confusion about what exactly the organizational structure of the new system was supposed to be. Morris had the degrees, but he had not yet created the institutional framework that would make them the foundation of a lasting organization, rather than a personal practice transmitted by a single founding teacher. That institutional framework was provided by Robert McCoy, a New York publisher and Masonic writer who had been one of Morris's early collaborators and who, in 1866, revised and reorganized the degree system and published it in a form that provided a complete organizational manual for the establishment of local chapters. McCoy's revision was the practical document that made the Eastern Star a real institution rather than a personal initiatory system, and it is to McCoy's organizational work as much as to Morris's degree creation that the order owes its eventual success. The tension between the two men over credit and over the specific form the organization should take was real, and produced a period of organizational confusion in the 1860s and 70s that threatened to prevent the Eastern Star from ever achieving the coherent national structure that both men ultimately wanted for it. The General Grand Chapter of the Order of the Eastern Star, the national governing body that coordinates the work of the state and local chapters, was formally established in 1876. And from that organizational consolidation forward, the order grew with a speed that reflected both the genuine appeal of what it offered and the specific historical moment in which it was offering it. The period between the Civil War and the end of the 19th century was the great age of American fraternal organization, the period in which the lodges and the orders and the benefit societies and the civic clubs that would eventually reach a combined membership of tens of millions of Americans were being founded and consolidated and expanding their reach into every city and every town in the country. The Eastern Star was part of this wave, growing in parallel with the Masonic lodges, whose members provided a ready source of potential chapter membership. By the end of the 19th century, the order had chapters in every state and in several countries outside the United States, and its membership had grown into the hundreds of thousands. The specific demographic that the Eastern Star drew most heavily from was the same demographic that provided the backbone of American civic and religious life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The wives and daughters and mothers of the professional and merchant class, the women who were the primary organizers of church life and charitable activity and community social institutions in the towns and small cities of the American heartland, who had the combination of education and time and social commitment that fraternal membership required, and who found in the Eastern Star a form of organized moral and spiritual life that offered something the existing institutions of church and charitable society did not: the specific quality of initiatory experience, the sense of belonging to a community defined by shared passage through a sequence of transformative experiences rather than simply by shared.
What if you could trade on this? This is Kalshi, a regulated exchange where you trade on real-world events. Each question has two sides, yes or no. If you think the Fed will cut rates, you buy yes.
By shared social affiliation. The chapter room in which Eastern Star ceremonies were conducted was organized in a spatial configuration that encoded in physical form the symbolic system of the degrees. The chapter room was not a lodge room, and the Eastern Star was careful about this distinction, maintaining a physical and ceremonial separation from the Masonic lodge that reflected the order's complicated official relationship to Freemasonry. But the chapter room's spatial organization, the positioning of the 5 primary officers at points corresponding to the 5 heroines, the arrangement of the floor plan to create a path through the room that the candidates followed during initiation, The use of specific colors and symbols at each station was recognizably derived from the same tradition of sacred space as the lodge room, the tradition in which the physical arrangement of the ceremonial space was itself a statement of meaning, a three-dimensional text that the initiated could read and the uninitiated were not equipped to interpret. The 5 principal officers of the Eastern Star chapter occupied stations corresponding to the 5 points of the inverted star and the 5 heroines. The worthy matron, the presiding officer, occupied the eastern station, the position of the rising sun, the station that in the Masonic Lodge belongs to the worshipful master. The significance of this correspondence was not accidental. In a system that officially positioned itself as adjacent to but distinct from Freemasonry, the choice to place the presiding female officer in the East, the station of highest authority in the Masonic symbolic geography, was a specific statement about the dignity and the authority of the worthy matron's position that the Masonic tradition's own spatial symbolism was being used to make. The worthy patron, the presiding male officer, occupied a secondary position, working in cooperation with the worthy matron but subordinate to her authority in the chapter room, an inversion of the gendered hierarchy that governed virtually every other institutional space in 19th century American life. And this specific feature of the Eastern Star's governance structure is worth dwelling on. In the lodge room, authority flowed from the worshipful master, always male, in a chain that descended through male officers to the membership. In the chapter room, authority flowed from the worthy matron, always female, in a chain that positioned male membership in a relationship of supportive participation rather than governance. The Eastern Star chapter room was, for the men who entered it, one of the only institutional spaces in the world of their experience where a woman held formal authority over them and exercised it with the specific ceremonial dignity of an initiatory office. For the women who held those offices, it was one of the only spaces in their institutional life where the authority they exercised was genuine rather than advisory, ceremonial rather than domestic, and recognized by the men in the room as legitimate rather than derivative. The question of the Eastern Star's relationship to the women's suffrage movement and to the broader project of women's political advancement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is one that the Order's historians have approached with considerable caution, partly because the Order's official posture was and remains non-political, and partly because the specific character of the Order's membership in different periods included women on both sides of the suffrage debate. What can be said is that the network of organizational skills, parliamentary procedure, public speaking experience, and civic engagement that Eastern Star membership provided was exactly the set of capacities that women's political organizing required, and that many of the women who were most active in the suffrage movement in its final decades had been formed in part by their experience in fraternal organizations, including the Eastern Star. The Order was not a suffrage organization, but it was an institution in which women exercised real organizational authority and real ceremonial dignity within a culture that offered them very little of either in other institutional contexts, and the skills and the confidence that experience produced did not stay inside the chapter room. The Order's relationship to the specific experience of Black American women is one of the most important and most consistently under-examined dimensions of its history. The Prince Hall Masonic tradition, the historically Black branch of American Freemasonry, that had been founded when Prince Hall and a group of free Black men were denied admission to white lodges in the 1770s and subsequently chartered by the British military, developed its own system of women's degrees in parallel with and partially in response to the White Eastern Star. The Eastern Star, associated with Prince Hall Masonry, developed as a distinct institutional stream, with its own state and national governing bodies, its own traditions and variations on the degree system, and a membership that served as one of the primary vehicles for black women's civic and fraternal life in the United States from the late 19th century onward. The women of the Prince Hall Eastern Star were among the most active organizers of black civic life in the era of segregation. Using the network and the skills and the institutional infrastructure the order provided to build the churches and the schools and the community organizations that sustained black communities through the decades of systematic exclusion from the civic institutions of white America. Their story is the Eastern Star's story, as much as the story of the predominantly white chapters that the standard histories have tended to treat as the organization's main trunk. The symbolic system that underlies the Eastern Star degrees draws from a considerably wider range of sources than the 5 biblical heroines who provide its surface structure. Morris was a deeply read man in the tradition of Masonic and Hermetic symbolism, and the connections between his degree system and the broader tradition of Western esotericism are visible to anyone who examines the symbolic vocabulary of the degrees with the background knowledge to recognize the references. The 5 points of the star, as a system of 5-fold symbolic organization, echo the 5-fold structures that appear throughout the Western esoteric tradition, from the Pythagorean pentagram to the 5 elements of Chinese cosmology to the 5 wounds of Christ in Christian mystical symbolism. The specific association of each point with a color, a virtue, a human story, and a divine quality is structurally identical to the system of correspondences that the Kabbalistic tradition uses to organize the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life, and that the Golden Dawn inherited from that tradition and systematized into the correspondence system that underlies all modern Western ceremonial magic. Whether Morris was drawing on these traditions consciously, or whether he arrived at structural parallels through independent working from the Masonic and biblical materials he knew, is a question the sources do not clearly answer. The 5 heroines themselves, as a symbolic system, encode in their specific stories something more complex than a simple catalogue of female virtue. Edda's story in the Book of Judges is one of the darkest in the Hebrew Bible. Her father Jephthah made a rash vow to God before a military campaign, promising to sacrifice whatever came out of his door first upon his return if God granted him victory. It was his daughter who came out first, running to meet him with music and dancing. Jephthah's anguish is recorded in the text. His daughter's response is recorded too. She asked only for 2 months to go into the hills and grieve her virginity with her companions before returning to her father to fulfill the vow. She returned. The text says only that Jephthah did with her what he had vowed. Jewish tradition has been arguing about the meaning and the morality of this story for thousands of years. Morris chose to place it at the first point of the Eastern Star and to call the virtue it represents fidelity. And the choice tells you something about his understanding of what fidelity means when taken to its absolute limit, which is not the comfortable version of the virtue, but the version that requires submitting to an obligation that destroys you. That Morris chose this story, among all the stories available to him, as the foundation of the first degree of a system designed to provide women with a moral curriculum, is a choice that rewards examination. He was not asking women to be merely obedient. He was asking them to recognize that genuine fidelity, the kind that matters, is the kind that costs something irreplaceable. The Eastern Star was not a system designed to make women more comfortable with their subordination. It was a system designed to show women the full moral weight of the virtues they were being asked to embody, including the weight of what those virtues required in their most extreme expressions. The Order's membership in the 20th century included women and men whose contributions to American public life were substantial and wide-ranging. The Eastern Star's presence in the networks of civic and charitable organization that structured American community life across the country meant that its members were active participants in the construction of the infrastructure of community, in the hospitals and the schools and the charitable organizations and the community institutions that the fraternal culture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries built as its specific contribution to American civilization. The Eastern Star has contributed millions of dollars to charitable causes, including cancer research, scholarships, and support for the families of Masons and Eastern Star members in need, through a network of charitable programs that the individual chapters have administered with the organizational competence that fraternal membership develops. The Order's connection to some of the most significant moments in American political history runs through the specific membership of its chapters in the communities where those moments occurred, through the women who held worthy matrons' offices in chapters across the country, and who were simultaneously active in the civic and political life of their communities in ways that the Order's non-political official posture does not capture. The network the Eastern Star created was not a political network in the formal sense, but it was a network in the most important sense. A set of relationships built on shared initiatory experience and mutual commitment that operated across the official boundaries of institutional life and created connections between women who might otherwise have had no mechanism for knowing each other. In the decades before women had full access to the official structures of civic life, that network was one of the most important unofficial structures available to them. The physical spaces where the Eastern Star has conducted its work, the chapter halls attached to Masonic temples across the United States and around the world, are among the most distinctive institutional spaces in American civic architecture. The Masonic temple, typically the most architecturally ambitious, non-religious building in the small American city or town that contains one, with its classical facade and its ceremonial hall and its lodge rooms and its chapter rooms, arranged in a spatial configuration that encodes in brick and stone the symbolic geography of the Masonic system, was also the space where the Eastern Star chapter gathered. The women who climbed those steps and passed through those doors were entering the most architecturally serious space in their community, a space that had been built to announce through its physical presence that what happened inside it mattered. This spatial experience was not incidental to the Order's identity. It was part of what the Order offered to its members, the specific dignity of gathering in a space that had been built for serious purposes, that embodied in its architecture the conviction that the work of moral formation was worth the investment of marble and carved stone and elaborately painted ceilings. The Order's symbolism has attracted persistent attention from the specific tradition of Christian fundamentalism that treats any use of esoteric or Masonic symbolism as evidence of satanic allegiance, and the specific form this attention has taken in the 20th and 21st centuries in the conspiracy literature and the online culture that has inherited and amplified the anti-Masonic tradition, has shaped the Order's public image in ways that have been deeply unfair to what the Order actually is and what it actually does. The Eastern Star is not a satanic organization. It is not a vehicle for the worship of Lucifer or Baphomet or any other entity that the demonological imagination of its critics has associated with it. It is a fraternal organization built around 5 stories from the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, organized by a Kentucky schoolteacher who believed that women deserved access to the specific kind of moral education that the initiatory tradition could provide, and sustained for 170 years by the commitment of its members to the work of moral formation and mutual support and charitable service that the order has always understood to be its fundamental purpose. The inverted star on the wall is not an inverted cross. The ceremonies conducted under it are not black masses. The women who wear the emblem of the Eastern Star and who hold the offices of the worthy matron and the associate matron, and the secretary and the treasurer and the conductress, are not priestesses of darkness. They are women who have been initiated into a system of moral symbolism, whose specific vocabulary is unfamiliar to most of the people who encounter it from outside, and whose unfamiliarity creates exactly the conditions in which fear and projection flourish. The history of the Order of the Eastern Star is the history of what happens when you give women a serious institutional space for serious moral work, and it is a history that deserves to be told with the seriousness it has always been denied. Rob Morris died in 1898, having spent the last decades of his life working as a Masonic lecturer and poet, and continuing to advocate for the Eastern Star and for women's place in the broader fraternal tradition. He had traveled to the Holy Land in 1868, and again in 1873, and his experiences there produced a body of writing about the geography of the biblical narratives that informed his understanding of the stories he had built the Eastern Star degrees around. He was buried in LaGrange, Kentucky, and his grave is a place of pilgrimage for Eastern Star members who understand him as the father of their tradition. Robert McCoy, whose organizational work was as essential as Morris's creative work to the Order's eventual success, he continued to publish Masonic books and manuals throughout the second half of the 19th century and died in 1905. His revision of the Eastern Star degree system, published in 1866, remained the foundational organizational document of the Order for generations, and is still part of the historical foundation on which the current Order rests. The General Grand Chapter of the Order of the Eastern Star continues to meet every 2 years at its international session, bringing together representatives from the state Grand Chapters in the United States, and from the Grand Chapters in countries around the world that have established their own national organizations. The membership continues to decline, as the membership of virtually every fraternal organization in the United States continues to decline, for the same combination of demographic and cultural reasons that have been eroding the fraternal tradition across the board since its peak in the mid-20th century. The specific challenge that the Eastern Star faces, in addition to the general challenges facing all fraternal organizations, is that the specific need it was founded to meet, the need for an institutional space in which women could exercise genuine authority and receive genuine initiatory experience, and build genuine civic networks, outside the structures of a society that excluded them from its official institutions, has been substantially addressed by the broader social changes of the past century. The women who want to develop organizational skills and exercise institutional authority and build professional networks now have access to many channels that did not exist when Morris was creating his degrees in the 1850s. The specific value of what the Eastern Star offers in that environment is harder to articulate than it was when it was one of the only such channels available. But the initiatory experience itself, the specific quality of transformation that comes from passing through a sequence of carefully designed symbolic experiences in the company of people who have made the same passage, is not something that can be fully replicated by any of the channels that have opened to women in the intervening decades. The fraternal tradition understood something about the human need for initiation and the specific form that need takes in the context of a community of practice, and that understanding is encoded in the degrees of the Eastern Star in a form that the Order's members still encounter and still report as genuinely affecting in ways that no professional development seminar or civic organization or online community has quite replicated. The star still hangs in the chapter room. The 5 points still carry their colors and their symbols, and the stories of the 5 women whose moral choices became the foundation of a tradition that's been shaping the inner lives of its members for the better part of 2 centuries. Ada and Ruth and Esther and Martha and Electa are still there, in the degree work that the worthy matron still confers on the candidates who come before her, seeking what the Order has always offered. The specific thing the Order offers is not easily named in the vocabulary of the contemporary world, which is one reason the Order is so consistently overlooked by the contemporary world. But it is something real. It is the thing that every serious initiatory tradition has always offered, the thing that the human being is changed by, that cannot be received sitting still, that requires the candidate to move through the space and to face the questions, and to give the answers, and to have the experience of passage, of crossing from one condition to another, of arriving on the other side of the threshold as something the person they were when they began was not. The star in the east has been seen. The journey toward it is still being made in chapter rooms across the world by women and men who have chosen to enter the oldest available form of the human attempt to educate the soul. The Order is quieter now than it was at its height, but it is still there. It has always been there. And in the specific silence of the chapter room, in the specific quality of attention that the ceremony creates, something that was begun in the 1850s by a Kentucky schoolteacher who believed that women deserved initiation as much as men, has continued without interruption, passing from worthy matron to candidate to worthy matron again, generation by generation, star by star, the light of the East still traveling toward anyone who is willing to go to meet it. The world that Rob Morris moved through in the years when he was developing the Eastern Star degrees was the world of American fraternal organization at its most generative moment, the period in the 1840s and 1850s when the Masonic lodges and the Odd Fellows and the various benefit societies and fraternal orders were expanding their reach into every corner of American civic life, and when the question of what role women would play in this expanding fraternal culture was being actively debated in every lodge and every parlor in the country. Morris was not the only person thinking about this question. He was the person who thought about it most systematically and most practically, and who produced a workable answer in a form that the existing fraternal infrastructure could accommodate and transmit. The specific social problem that the Eastern Star was designed to address went beyond the philosophical question of whether women deserved access to initiatory experience. It addressed a practical problem that the fraternal culture of the period had created and not solved. The problem of what happened to the wives and daughters and mothers of Masons when the men in their lives were absent at lodge, or when those men died and left their families without the network of mutual support that lodge membership had provided. The fraternal benefit system that the lodges operated in the 19th century was a genuine welfare system, providing financial support to the families of deceased members, assistance to members in financial distress, and the network of mutual obligation that ensured a Mason's family would not be entirely alone in a crisis. But this system was available only to members, and women were not members. The families of Masons received the benefits of membership only through their relationship to a male member, which meant that when the male member died, the family's connection to the network was severed precisely at the moment when the network's support was most needed. The Eastern Star addressed this directly by creating a system in which women and the female relatives of Masons could themselves be members, could themselves be part of the network, could themselves have claims on the mutual support and the mutual obligation that fraternal membership created. A woman who was a member of the Eastern Star was not dependent on her relationship to a male Mason for her connection to the fraternal community. She was herself a member, with her own initiatory history and her own network of chapter relationships, and her own standing in the fraternal community that was hers regardless of what happened to the men in her life. This was not a trivial thing in the social world of the mid-19th century United States, where a woman's civic and social identity was defined almost entirely through her relationships to male family members rather than through her own institutional affiliations. The degree work through which Eastern Star members were initiated was also a form of education that the women who received it experienced as genuine, not as a simplified version of the male Masonic system, condescendingly.
If you qualify for SNAP, Medicaid, and more, you only pay $6.47 a month for a Walmart Plus membership, with free same-day delivery, free returns from home, and now up to 15% off subscription orders over $35. Claim your free 30-day trial.
Adapted for women, but as a system in its own right, built from its own sources and organized around its own symbolic logic, that offered something the Masonic system did not. The specific experience of seeing women in positions of moral and narrative authority, of receiving the stories of women whose moral choices had consequences that the whole of subsequent history had been shaped by, as the foundational texts of an initiatory curriculum. The Masonic system's central figures are all male: Hiram Abiff, Solomon, Hiram King of Tyre. The Eastern Star's central figures are all female. This is not a small difference. It is the difference between a system that uses the stories of women as peripheral and decorative, and a system that places women's stories at the center of its moral architecture and treats them as the primary vehicles of the tradition's deepest teachings. The specific theology implicit in Morris's choice of heroines is worth examining more carefully than it usually receives. Ada and Ruth are from the Hebrew Bible. Esther is from the Hebrew Bible. Martha is from the Christian New Testament. Electa is from the early church. The 5 women span the full breadth of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and their stories together constitute a kind of theology of women's moral agency that cuts across the standard theological accounts of women's role in both traditions. Ada represents the Hebrew tradition's recognition that fidelity can be absolute even when it leads to destruction. Ruth represents the Hebrew tradition's recognition that the obligations of love can transcend the obligations of blood and nation, and the expectations of one's own community. Esther represents the Hebrew tradition's recognition that political courage exercised by a woman can save an entire people. Martha represents the Christian tradition's recognition that women can engage with the deepest theological questions with the same directness as any disciple. Electa represents the early Christian tradition's recognition that women were the primary keepers of the community's physical space and social infrastructure, the people on whose domestic labor and domestic courage the church's survival depended. Together, these five figures present a portrait of women's moral and spiritual life that is considerably more complex and considerably more serious than the official theology of either Judaism or Christianity had typically been willing to produce. And the fact that Morris encoded this portrait in an initiatory system and made it the foundational curriculum of an organization that would eventually number in the millions is one of the reasons the Eastern Star deserves to be taken more seriously than it usually is in the histories of American religion and American women's life. The ceremony of initiation into the Eastern Star was designed, as all serious initiatory ceremonies are designed, to produce an experience that the candidate carries forward from the ceremony into the rest of their life. An experience that changes not merely the candidate's social affiliation, but their understanding of who they are and what they are capable of and what they are obligated to. The specific mechanism through which this change is produced in the Eastern Star is the same mechanism that all initiatory traditions have used, the mechanism of narrative identification, the specific experience of recognizing yourself in a story, of seeing your own moral situation reflected in the situation of a figure whose choices and whose courage and whose cost are presented to you not as historical fact, but as a living question about your own capacity for the same virtue. The candidate who receives the Adda degree is not simply being told the story of Jephthah's daughter. She's being asked whether she is capable of Adda's fidelity. She's being asked to encounter the full weight of what genuine fidelity means, including its most demanding and most costly expression, and to decide whether she's willing to take that virtue seriously rather than simply claiming it. This is serious work. It is the kind of work that the initiatory tradition has always understood to be serious, that the mystery religions of antiquity understood to be serious, that the Masonic tradition understands to be serious, and that the Eastern Star has understood to be serious since the moment Morris first administered the degrees to a group of women in a Kentucky parlor in the 1850s and watched their faces change as the narrative of each heroine unfolded and the full moral weight of each woman's choice came clear. The order is not a social club. It is an institution for the cultivation of character, organized according to the specific insight that character is formed not through instruction but through experience. Not through being told what virtue is, but through encountering virtue in a form that makes the demand of it visceral and immediate and personal. The specific architecture of the chapter ceremony encodes the logic of the five heroines in spatial form. The candidate moves through the chapter room in a specific path, encountering each of the five principal officers in sequence, receiving the symbol and the story, and the moral teaching of each heroine at each station, so that the journey through the room is simultaneously a physical journey and an initiatory one, a movement through five different moral landscapes, each complete in itself, and each contributing to the cumulative understanding that the full ceremony aims to produce. This ceremonial path is not a circle, as the Masonic floor work often is, but a sequence that has a beginning and an end, a direction and a destination, because the Eastern Star's initiatory logic is not cyclical but progressive, each degree not returning the candidate to the beginning, but carrying them forward toward a synthesis that is greater than any of its five parts. The relationship between the Order of the Eastern Star and the Masonic tradition has been one of the most complicated and most consistently misunderstood relationships in American fraternal history. The Masonic Grand Lodges have never formally recognized the Eastern Star as a Masonic organization.
You're accidentally wasting your best skill. You called it. You knew it. You were right. That's the frustrating part. Being right doesn't pay. Unless you actually do something about it, this is Kalshi. You can trade inflation data, weather, crypto prices, even snowfall.
Organization. And this official non-recognition is one of the primary sources of the public confusion about what the Eastern Star actually is and what its relationship to Freemasonry actually constitutes. The Eastern Star uses Masonic membership as a requirement for male members, meaning that a man who joins the Eastern Star must be a Master Mason in good standing. The female members are required to have a specific relationship to a Master Mason, being the wife or daughter or mother or sister or widow of one. The organization meets in Masonic temple facilities in most chapters. Its symbol incorporates the letter G that appears at the center of the Masonic square and compass. Its degree work is conducted using the specific spatial and ceremonial vocabulary that Morris drew from his Masonic background. And yet the Grand Lodges of Freemasonry have always maintained that the Eastern Star is not a Masonic organization, that it is a separate and distinct institution that happens to require Masonic affiliation as a condition of male membership. This official position has always been something of a fiction, maintained for institutional reasons that have more to do with the politics of Masonic governance than with the actual character of the Eastern Star. The order was built by a Master Mason, using Masonic symbolic vocabulary, for the specific purpose of extending something very much like the Masonic initiatory experience to women who could not receive it in the regular lodge. To say that this organization is not Masonic in any meaningful sense requires a definition of Masonic that is narrower than the order's actual character warrants. What the official position actually reflects is the Masonic establishment's consistent commitment to the principle of male exclusivity in the lodge room. A commitment that the existence of the Eastern Star was specifically designed to work around, and that the official non-recognition of the Eastern Star as Masonic allows the Grand Lodges to maintain intact. The Eastern Star is not in the lodge room. Therefore, the lodge room remains male. The fiction is useful and has been maintained for 170 years. The women who have led the Eastern Star at every level, from the worthy matron of the local chapter to the worthy grand matron of the state, grand chapter to the most worthy grand matron of the general grand chapter, have done so within an institution that asked them to exercise genuine authority in a culture that provided very few institutional contexts for women's authority. And they have done it with a competence and a dedication that the order's sustained vitality over nearly 2 centuries reflects. The worthy matron who opens the chapter with the formal declarations of her office, who presides over the initiation of candidates, who directs the ceremonial work of her officers, who manages the administrative business of the chapter, and who represents the chapter in the broader organizational life of the order, is exercising a form of institutional leadership that is as real and as demanding as any comparable position in civic life. The women who've held these positions have been shaped by them, have developed through them the specific combination of organizational competence and ceremonial presence and interpersonal skill that leadership of a complex institution requires. Nusky, and they have carried those capacities out of the chapter room into every other institutional context in which they have participated. This is the Eastern Star's most enduring contribution to American life. Not the specific ceremonies or the specific symbolism or the specific charitable programs, important as all of these are, but the ongoing production, generation after generation, of women who have been formed by the experience of genuine institutional leadership in a ceremonial context that treated their authority as legitimate and their work as serious. In a country that spent most of its history denying women access to the official institutions of public life, the Eastern Star was one of the places where women learned to lead, learned to govern, learned to manage the complex social and ceremonial machinery of a serious organization, and learned to do it with a dignity that the official world's refusal to recognize their authority could not diminish. The Star still turns on the walls of chapter rooms from rural Alabama to the Pacific Northwest, to the chapters in Australia and Canada and Brazil and the Philippines and the other countries where the Order has established its presence. The colors still mark the 5 points. The 5 heroines still stand in their stations, still embodying the specific virtues that a Kentucky schoolteacher believed were the foundation of moral life, still asking the candidates who stand before them the questions that genuine initiation has always asked. Do you understand what fidelity actually costs? Do you understand what constancy actually requires? Do you understand what loyalty means when the price